set state, this dot state, class components, hope. Yep, essentially we've been using React, right? We've been using React to manage our state. We're using this dot set state, we're using this dot state in the constructor. We have been using React, and React has these methods, it has state management built into it. And that's what we've used so far, and it's worked great, right? Because we haven't built anything that has been too complicated when it comes to state, right? We've only been working with maybe one, maybe two nested components, right? Our component trees have been very simple, our apps have been very simple, so we haven't had to deal with a lot of state. And in those cases, React state works really well. You'll see in a second when we start to get into Redux that the actual implementation of Redux and setting it up is kind of complicated. It's a little more work than you would need for a simple application. So it's important to note that Redux is meant for more complex applications, for more complex scenarios, but React state itself is more than enough for simple applications. So now that we're kind of graduating from simple React applications, we're going to start getting into more complex applications. We're now going to get into Redux, which allows us to manage more complex state. Yeah, we will get into that, Benedict. That's essentially the overarching purpose of Redux. So first of all, so Benedict kind of mentioned that we could have state in different places, but why is that bad? What are some problems that we get with React state? We just use React state by default. What are some downfalls, some drawbacks, some things that might be a problem? Prop trilling, you lose track of it, it only goes one way. React cannot go back. You have to track it all over your code. Good, great answers. Yep, so essentially, I see a few people typing. I'll give you a second to submit your answers if you have something else. Hard to know which components need to have state. Yep, mutable, yep. Have to repeat logic in different components, that's a huge one. Yeah, yep, good, Sandy. So essentially, React state is something that's component specific, right? So every React component has its own state, right? You have this dot state object, and that's unique to that component, okay? Now, that component can pass it through to its children, right? It can pass that prop through to its children components, and it can pass those state values down to the children components. But that can sometimes be a problem, especially if, I mean, think about a scenario where your children components had their children components, and those children components have their own children components. And it just goes down further and further and further. If one of those deeply nested child components rely on the state from the top component, from main app.js, whatever your parent component is, you essentially have to send that state value all the way down that tree, all the way down. Even if components in the middle aren't using it, it still has to get sent all the way down to the component that actually relies on it. That's what's called prop drilling. Okay, you're essentially passing props through the component tree until it gets the component that relies on it. Okay. Another one, someone mentioned it's mutable. Yep. So when we're working with React state, we'll get into with the concept of immutability in a minute, but it is not immutable like Redux state is. So that's definitely a downside. So let me show you, I'll show you a quick diagram that might help you grasp this a little better. Any questions so far? I understand we are talking about some complex concepts here tonight, so we're going to take it slow. And if you have any questions, speak up. Yeah, Benedict, Gramps, if you want to, the grandfather component, I guess you could call it the grandfather component. If you want to send some kind of prop, some kind of state value from a grandparent down to the great 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 grandchild, right? You have to go all the way through that tree. All right. So take a look at this diagram here. This is essentially what we talked about, right? This is what would be considered a complex component tree. All right, so we have our app.js, that's our grandfather component, right? It's at the very top. That's what is the base component for our app, okay? App.js has two children components. They have one component here, one component here. Each of those components have their own children components. Each of those components have their own children components, so on and so forth, right? And in this diagram, let's say foo and bar were state values that were required, right? So if this component down here relies on the bar state, on the bar value, and this component right here relies on the bar value, you essentially have to go to the nearest common parent to get that value. That's the parent that has to have the state on it, right? In this case, you'd have to go all the way back up to app.js. And app.js would rely, or app.js would be responsible for maintaining that state, right? And it would send that state all the way down to whatever needed it in the component tree. All right, so you see how this is problematic. If you look at this diagram, there's components here in the middle that don't even care about that state. They don't care. This component right here, this component doesn't care about bar, but it still has to pass it through to its child component because its child component cares about it, right? Yes, so foo and bar are just random words. That's something you'll learn in the programming community. Foo and bar. It's what's called the oh, I can't remember the name of it. There's a name for it. Let me. Metasynthetic variables. That's what it's called. So foo, bar, those are metasynthetic variables. They're basically just example strings that we use, placeholder strings, when we're talking about concepts, when we're testing stuff. All right. So just like bar, foo in this example, right? So foo would be required in this component. It would be required in this component. It would be required in this component, right? And in order to share that state between all of these different components, you have to find the closest parent that connects those components. In this case, the closest parent would be app.js. So app.js would be responsible for that state. Any questions so far? Thanks for posting that, Tara. Perfect. So that you can have it. I can post all of these in Slack if you want them for reference as well. Yes, we're still talking about downsides, Ali. So this is a downside of using pure React state. Yep, you absolutely could, Benedict. You could do it this way, right? There's nothing stopping you from doing it this way. You could just put all of this state in app.js. You could pass it down to all of the components that need it, do all of the prop drilling, get it down to where it needs to go. But yeah, when you hear the words prop drilling, that means that you have components essentially in the middle that don't rely on that state, that are still receiving it and have to pass it on. It gets very complicated. So let's say that in this example, let's say that app.js wasn't the absolute parent component. Say there was another component somewhere off on the side here that was another piece of your app, right, that still relied on foobar, on the foobar variables from the state. Then app.js is no longer the highest common parent that connects everything, right? Then you'd have to go another layer up and put the state in another parent component and then pass it through the tree so it goes to the other side, right? So you can see this can get very, very messy depending on the complexity of your app. And this is where Redux comes in to save us. All right, so Redux is, it's It's essentially a lightweight library that allows us to manage a single state for our application, a single state tree. So if you look at, I'll post a link to the Redux website. I don't know if you've looked at it yet. Should just be redux.js.org. All right, so let's take a look at the website really quick. So Redux, just like it says here, it's a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. So there's a few different pieces to it that we're going to cover, which we'll get into in just a second. But essentially, let me give you a little bit of history as to where Redux comes from. So Redux, originally, before Redux was created, there was a library called Flux, or a methodology called Flux, just F-L-U-X, Flux. And it was a pattern that Facebook created to solve this problem of complicated state, right, of managing state throughout different components. And Flux was a little bit complicated. It had some problems. Let me show you the diagram of Flux. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about the details of this, but this was the idea of Flux, right? This is how they solved that problem of maintaining state throughout a complex application. And you see this is complicated, right? You got store, you got callbacks, dispatcher, all of this stuff. And so essentially this was the norm for quite a while until this guy named Dan Abramov, he came up with Redux. And what Redux is, it's a simplified version of this flow, of this methodology. It takes a lot of the concepts from Flux and it simplifies it and puts it into an easy to use library. So it's kind of important to know where Flux or where Redux comes from and how it kind of came from the idea of Flux. All right, so if we look at the website for Redux, I'll show you the flow for Redux in just a second. But it essentially helps you write, just like it says here, it helps you write applications that behave consistently, run in different environments, and are easy to test. It's centralized. So essentially, instead of having state throughout all of your different React components, instead of React components holding on to their own state and being responsible for passing it to their children, you have a single state tree that's outside of the context of your app or outside of the context of your components. You have a single state tree, and that's all there is. It's just a single state tree, and then whatever needs that state, it connects to that tree, right? And then whenever that tree changes, it sends all of the updates down to whatever is connected to it. When I say state tree, it's a little bit different than a component tree. A tree is kind of just like a computer science data, a data structure, something that you'll probably learn at some point in the curriculum. A tree is, yeah, it's just a data structure, so it can be used for a lot of different concepts. So when I say state tree, we're essentially saying just like an object, right? Because an object is essentially a tree, because you can have sub-objects, you can have different data types within that object. So the state tree is just an object. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second. This will be clear once we start to see the diagrams. So essentially, yeah, when it comes down to it, Redux is just a library that someone wrote that gives us access to a global state tree instead of React components depending on their own state, all right? So if you haven't looked through the Redux website, make sure you go look through it, read some of their documentation, read some of the history behind it. It will give you a better feel for how it works. So let's look at that crazy component tree that we had going on before. Now this is using it in a context of Redux, right? So instead of sending those props, sending those values down from app.js to the child components, you're essentially connecting all of the components that rely on those values. You're connecting them to the Redux state, all right? And the Redux state is global. It's a single state tree for your entire application. It doesn't depend on any components. It's not connected to any component specifically. It's just one giant state for your entire application, and your components connect to it when they need it. All right, that's really all it is when it comes down to it. All right, any questions so far? Yep. When it comes down to it, Benedict, Redux is just a way for your components to get data. Right? And before we were using React state, we were using the built-in state to get that data, to pass data around. But we're no longer going to use the internal state. We're going to use Redux for that state. That's what it comes down to, is managing state. So what are some things that could be in our state? What are some values that we would essentially hold in our state? Give me some examples. Yeah, name, age, location, form data. Yep, anything that's potentially coming from a form. IDs, yep. Maybe some other things, maybe like whether a certain menu is open, right? Or maybe something even like the current location, the route, that could potentially be part of the state. Essentially, any piece of data that's changing in your app, or any data that's pulled in from an outside source, that's what's considered the state, right? So it can be anything. It can be form data, it can be anything that determines how the UI is showing at that current point in time. That is what state is. All right. So instead of this, instead of sending state down through props, instead of prop drilling all the way down to the components that need it, like we would with React state, we are simply connecting everything to a global state, Redux state. Okay, take a few minutes to process that, think about that. You know, it's confusing. I promise it will click at some point. Really, when it comes down to it, we're just dealing with state. We're dealing with data, okay? And Redux allows us to access all of that data from anywhere. We're gonna see an example of it in code a little bit later, and it will make a lot more sense when we do that. So let's talk about the flow of Redux. So we talked about the flow of Flux, right, in this monstrosity, but let's look at the flow of Redux. It's a little bit simpler. Essentially, Redux is a one-way flow, right? So this is the flow of Redux. This is all it consists of. So we talked about the store already. The store is essentially the state, right? It's that global state tree, the thing that's holding the state for our application, whether it's form data or something coming from an API, anything. That's what's getting saved in the store. All right, and then we have our UI. In this diagram, what would the UI be? What would you guys consider the UI to be? What do you think? What is the UI? The React app. Yeah, good, Cal. The UI is just our React app, okay? It's important to know that Redux is not React specific. Redux is its own thing. You can use Redux in the context of any JavaScript framework. You don't have to use it with React, all right? Redux is not specific to React. So in this case, in this diagram, the UI is React, and then everything up here, Redux. And then you'll see we install a helper library called React Redux that connects the two. But it's important to know that the Redux is not React specific. Redux is its own implementation. You can use it outside of React. You can use it in Angular. You can use it in Ember. You can even use it with plain vanilla JavaScript if you wanted to. It provides us functions to manage this flow. Okay, we're going to get to that in a second, Benedict, as to what each piece of this is. Please let me know if I'm going too fast, if I'm going too slow. I want to make sure you guys grasp this concept. Okay, so let's talk about, so we talked about this, we talked about the UI. Let's talk about actions, okay? So if we look at that flow, that tree, see that we can get our state values just by connecting to the Redux state, right? That's how we retrieve those values. But what if we want to change something? What if we want to update our state? That's where actions come into play, actions and reducers. Actions and reducers allow us to update that state, okay? So if you remember in our previous project, so I have this HTTP Ajax project that we were working from. If you remember, when we wanted to update those items in these child components, we had to pass through a function from the parent component. We had to pass through this update items method down as a prop to create, to edit, right? And then create and edit, we're responsible for calling this.props.update items, essentially calling that function from the parent and passing specific data to it. That's how we were mutating state before. The problem with this is it's two-way. This is a two-way operation, right? Our view is essentially changing the state. Our state is sending back more data, and our view is sending back more state. And it gets really complicated with this two-way flow. That's originally what's referred to as MVC. If you've ever heard of MVC, the MVC architecture. If you haven't heard about it yet, you probably will at some point. Essentially, in that architecture, model view controller is what it stands for. The view can still mutate the state, right? And so it can get really hard to debug when that's happening, because if the view is mutating state, sometimes your state will change. You're not necessarily sure what changed it or where that change came from. And that's a problem with this setup, because we're passing through that function to the child prop, and that child prop can call that, and it can get pretty complicated as to how, I mean, this is a simple example, but if this was a more complex app, having that two-way flow can cause problems. So when it comes to Redux, Redux is a one-way flow. So if you look at this diagram, you see it only flows one way. The UI does not have direct access to change that store, right? The only way that the UI can change the store is to go through the proper flow, to go through the action and the reducer. And the reducer is responsible for changing the store, and then the store sends down the new data to the UI, right? So that flow is one way. You would actually, in the MVC, Benedict, you would want the model to change the state. And the controller would be responsible for passing the data from the model to the view. Yep, it is very React. It's a very React-ish concept, because everything in React, remember, is top-down flow, right? Data is passed through from the parent component to the child component. You can't pass data from the child component up to the parent component unless you do this, right? Unless you pass through a function from the parent that receives a value. So you're right, it's very Reacty, it's a one-way flow, and it fits very well into the whole overarching idea of React and that one-way flow. Nope, it's always gonna be, so we'll talk about each one of these steps individually in a second, but it will always be in this order. So let's talk about actions first. So there's kind of three different types of action, or three different things we can focus on when it comes to actions. Let me open up an example. Okay, so we have three different things we're going to be working with. We're working with actions, okay? We're working with action creators, and we're working with action types. All right, these are the three things that we're going to talk about when it comes to actions. Okay, an action is simply what it sounds like. It's just something that needs to happen, right? It's update this, or open this menu, or change this value. And all it is, it's just going to be a string, right? It's just going to be a constant. We'll call it, and it's usually all uppercase. So you say like update value, right? That's going to be the action, and you just assign that to a constant. Does anybody know why we do this? Why we assign a string to a constant with the same name? Does anybody know why we, have you ever done this before? Why we assign the string of the same value to a constant variable of the same value? Yep, it avoids mistyping. So you're going to see this a lot when you're using Redux. The only real reason we're doing this is because if we're reusing this string over and over again, there's a chance that we might misspell it somewhere, right? If we misspell it somewhere, we're not going to get an error that said you misspelled that string. But if we use a constant instead, we'll get an error from JavaScript saying that constant doesn't exist. I'll show you. Yeah, I know that's kind of confusing. We'll see it in use in just a second. So an action is essentially just a string, a description of what's going to happen, right? It's a description of what's going to happen that's getting saved as a constant. These are just examples. Don't code along yet. Just examples, okay? Now an action, oh, I'm sorry. So that's actually an action type. I misspoke there. So an action type. So it's essentially describing what's going to happen, right? And then an action is an object that uses that type. So you're going to say type update value, right? And then an action is always going to accept a payload. So it's going to accept a type and a payload, and then it will be some value. Okay. I'll clean this up a little bit. These will all come together when we start using them. All right, and an action creator is simply a function that returns an action. Okay, so an action creator would be function update value would be returning essentially an action, right? Those are the three things that we're going to worry about when it comes to actions. So you'll see kind of the flow here. So we create these action types, right? Action types are describing something that's going to happen, whether it's updating a value or opening a menu, something that's changing in our state. It's going to describe something that's changing, that needs to change in our state. Okay, and then the action is an object that will get consumed by the reducer, which I'll show you in just a second. It's an object that uses an action type and the payload. So the payload is something that's going to be related to that action, right? So if you're updating a value, the payload is going to contain the new value, right? So the payload can be anything, depending on what your action is doing. Yep, any kind of data that your action is relying on. So if your action is, maybe your action is just opening a menu, right? So you're just going to be dealing with true and false, whether the menu is open or not. Your payload is going to be either true or false. Cool. And then your action creator is simply a function that you call that returns that action. Okay. Your action creator is something that you're going to call in your component itself. So when you hook up to Redux, you'll see this in a minute, when you hook up to Redux in your React component, you will call this function, and Redux will handle putting this function or putting this action through the reducer. The reducer will update the state, and the new state will come through the component. All right, so those are actions. So now let's talk about reducers. A reducer is simply a function that returns new state, okay? So the reducer is what's responsible for changing our state, for changing stuff in that global application state. Okay, whatever we return from our reducer function is going to be considered new state, right? So if we return a new value in here, it's going to be considered new state. Okay, and our reducer is essentially going to be a switch statement. If you've never done a switch statement before, it's a good time to review that. Essentially, a reducer is going to get our state, and it's going to get some kind of action, right, when it gets called. I realize these are very high-level examples, but when we actually get into coding Redux, it will do a lot of this for us, and it's going to hook it all together, and it's going to allow us to use all of this, in context with our state. So a reducer is simply a function The S code sometimes autocorrects stuff for me when I don't want it to, and it drives me crazy. It's a function that's going to receive our state. Okay, it receives our existing state. So this is our existing state right here. It's going to receive some kind of action, right? Some kind of object that's an action up here. And it's going to, depending on the action type, it's going to change the state and return new state. Okay, so essentially we would be switching over action.type, right? And if this was update value, then we would want to return some new state. And we would essentially return, we want to return a new object, so we don't want to mutate existing state. And we want to return, we would say some value is equal to the action.payload, right? Yeah, Benedict, so switch is just a long if statement, essentially. All right, so let's talk about immutability really quick. So who can explain to me what immutable means? What is an immutable object versus a mutable object? What is immutable? Yeah, Kale, immutable means it cannot be changed. You can't change it. Good, Michelle. So when it comes to Redux, this store right here, remember our store is just a giant object, right? It's a giant object that maintains our entire application state. That state is immutable. You can't change it, okay? The only way it can update, the only way it can get new values is by recreating an entirely new state with that new value, okay? This is one of the big ideas of Redux, is that it uses immutable state. And the benefit to doing that is every time you change the state, you can essentially save like a previous version of the state, and then you can time travel through your application to see different versions of your state at different points in time. So React state, I think it is not mutable by default. I think you can update it. And in that case, the problem with mutability, with having a mutable object like default React state, is that if something changes it, say like something deep in your code changes that state, it's not always obvious what's changing that value, right? It doesn't force that one-way flow, because data down below the state can update the value without going through the proper flows, without going through to the top and updating the flow so it comes back down, right? In this case, since our store is immutable, it can only flow one way, right? The UI cannot update the store directly because it's immutable. Yep, you only want the reducer to be able to update the state. You don't want to be able to update the state from the UI. Okay. So since that state is immutable, this existing state, we are returning a new object, right? That's building off of existing state. Who can tell me what this means? What does the three dots mean? Spread, yep. We're essentially saying take this existing state, create a new object, right? Clone that object, and add some value onto the end of it. If some value already exists on that object, replace it. All right. So we're returning new state from this reducer. All right. Any questions so far? So we have multiple action types. Let's say we had a delete value, right? Let's say we had another action type that was a delete value. That would give us another action that was using the delete value. Maybe the payload, instead of some value, it would be like an ID, right? We'd have an action creator for delete value. You'll see how action creators are used once we dive into the code. And then in our switch statement, you would just add another one, another case that's delete value. In that case, we would return the existing state without, I guess you would have to do like a return existing state dot find, or without, I don't remember what the function is, filter. You know, something like that. And then switch statements always need a default value, and in that case, we would just return the existing state. So essentially, anytime something needs to happen in our application, we just we create an action type, we create an action, and we add it to the reducer. We allow it to update the state. Yeah, I'm gonna get rid of that so that you can see all this on one page. Yep, exactly, Benedict. So the difference between actions and action creators. So actions are just an object, right? It's just an object that basically describes what's happening, and it uses an action type, and it gives you a value to use alongside that action type. An action creator is something that's actually called within the component, which you'll see in a second, that actually handles updating that data, that handles sending that action creator to the reducer. In this case, yes, Kevin, you only need one reducer. So essentially, if you had a ton of stuff, this reducer would be really long, right? If you had a complex application, what you can actually do is you can do multiple reducers and combine them into a single one, but we're not even going to worry about that right now. For now, just know that we will have a single reducer for your entire application. All right, so now that we've talked about this flow a little bit, we've kind of dip our feet into it a little bit. Who can tell me what the benefits of using Redux are? What are the benefits of using Redux and using this one-way flow? Yep, it centralizes state. That's a huge benefit. What else? More predictable? Yep. You can time travel? Yep. Don't worry about time travel. That's just a benefit of Redux that you probably won't even use during Lambda school. Yep, all great answers. What if something has happened? What if we want to update some value in our store, but we want to maybe like tweak that value before we actually update it? Well, then we can just do that in the reducer, right? We don't have to do that in every single component that's updating the state, right? Say that we had a counter, right? And the counter was incrementing by 1 every single time, right? And say that we had a button that was incrementing that counter in multiple components. Every time you press that button, it would increment the counter, it would update the state wherever it was. But say we wanted to change that increment value from 1 to 5, right? If we were using just pure React state, depending on how we've had it set up, you might have to go edit that value in multiple places. right? Because it would be essentially changing that state from the bottom view, right? From that view, it was changing the state and it was going up. So you would essentially have to change it in multiple places versus with Redux, it will only be happening in the reducer or maybe the action. And you only have to update it in one place. So now that we've kind of seen Redux, do you think it's always necessary to use Redux? No, absolutely not. You've probably seen that Redux is a little bit complicated, right? The flow is a little bit complicated. The concept is a little bit complicated. It's meant for complicated applications, right? Most of the time for simple applications, a React state is plenty. That's all you need. Redux is meant for complicated setups. Sometimes, a lot of the times it can be overkill. All right, any questions? So let's talk about this one more time. So what is an action? Explain to me what an action is and what it consists of. Yep, in that case, Benedict, you'd have to, I mean, you'd obviously have to know you'd have to know Redux, right? And it's something that you can implement later down the road. So if you already have an app that's using React State, you can definitely implement Redux later down the road if it gets more complicated. So give me a quick sentence. What is an action? Just an overarching purpose. What is the overarching purpose of an action in the context of Redux? Almost like a query? Yeah, Kevin? An event? Roger? Good. Yeah. An action, the overarching purpose of an action is something that the UI can call to update the state, right? If the UI wants to change something in this store, it has to call an action. What does it call specifically? What would the view call specifically in this context? Good, Junior. Yep. It will call a creator. So this function right here, this is what the front end, or I mean, this is what the component, okay, this is what React, this is what your component is calling. It is calling this function. And if your component is hooked up to Redux, Redux will pass this action down through the reducer and update the state. Yep, or the other way around, Benedict. So the UI is what talks to the actions talk to the reducers talk to the store talks to the UI, right? In this excuse me, in this case, the action doesn't know anything about the UI, right? You can't go backwards in this flow. The action doesn't know anything about the UI. The reducer doesn't know anything about the actions. The store doesn't know anything about the reducers, so on and so forth. It is a one-way flow operation. All right, so what is a reducer? What is the purpose of the reducer? Purpose of the reducer. Good. Yep, the purpose of the reducer is to update the state, right? That is the main purpose of the reducer. How does it know what to update? How does the reducer know what to update in the state? It uses a switch statement. Yep, that's part of it. Actions, yep. So a reducer is going to receive an action as a parameter. That action is going to be an object, just like that, right? It's going to have a type and it's going to have a payload. So the reducer, just like Tara said, is a pure function. It doesn't have any side effects. It doesn't do anything outside of looking at the existing state, looking at the action, changing or returning a new state based on the action and the existing state. That is the whole purpose of this reducer function. Okay, so it receives this action. The action is going to have a type. It's going to switch over the type. Depending on the type, it will look at the payload and return some new state based on the payload. All right. If this isn't clear for you, don't worry. I promise it will click at some point, and especially once we jump into the code, you'll see how it is used and how this flow is actually implemented. So the return value of the reducer function doesn't go into the UI directly. The return value of the reducer goes into the state, right? That's going to go into that global Redux state. And that global Redux state is what sends down data to the component itself. Any components that are subscribed to that state are going to receive those updates when it changes. Yep, the action is the return of the action creator. So it might actually be clearer if I do this. Const action, and this is going to return action. Okay. Yep, exactly, Benedict. The store is sending all of the data down to the views. Component still has to subscribe to the views, right? The component has to tell the store what it's expecting. But once it tells it what it's expecting, then once that value changes, it's going to receive the new value. All right. Any other questions? We went through that a little bit quickly. So let's take a 5-minute break. And when we come back, we'll jump into some code and actually see it in action. All right, so see you in 5 minutes. All right, go ahead and answer that poll if you would for me. All right, come on back. How are we feeling so far? How are we feeling about Redux? Give me a 1 to 5, 5 being you understand it great, 1 being you're still struggling. You feel okay until we start actually coding and you'll get confusing. Yeah, that's how it goes, right? Hopefully the coding, hopefully once we jump into the code, it'll be clearer for you and you'll start to understand it better. All right, I'm not seeing any 1s. That's very encouraging. Couple 2s, couple 3s. Please vote for 1 if you are completely lost. Please let me know if you're completely lost. I know this is a very complicated concept, but I promise it will click. Quicker for some of you than others, but it will click. All right. So let's do a quick overview. Making too much sense so far. This is it. I mean, this is it. That's the overarching concept of Redux. Now we just have to implement it. And implementing it is actually really easy, and you'll see that in just a second. Okay, so a quick overview. So Redux is a library. It's a concept, also a library, that allows us to have a global store that holds all of our state. The flow is one direction. You can only go in one direction. So if the UI wants to update the state, it calls an action. The action gets sent to the reducer with an action type and an action payload. The reducer changes the state. Well, it doesn't change the state. It returns a new state because it's immutable, right? It returns new state based on the type and based on the payload, changes the state, and the state then gets sent back down to the UI. Yeah, it follows the same pattern of React, right? It's one-way flow. Only this time it's dealing with data and not components. All right, any questions? Cool. Let's code. Let's do it. So I realize there's been a little bit of frustration with working from projects that don't necessarily match with the project on the training kit. But hopefully it kind of helps you get different viewpoints on the overarching concepts and, you know, kind of getting different experiences working with something versus just working in the same thing the whole time. So I do realize it's frustrating and I apologize. Please reach out to your TLs if you have specific questions, if you're struggling with anything in that regard. But I do think it's good to work in different projects, especially sometimes the training kit doesn't cover small little things that I do like to cover. So sometimes it will vary a little bit. And again, especially with the new content changes, Lambda School still could do better at synchronizing everything and making everything match up better. But I do think it's really good practice to work in different projects and see the overarching concepts in different capacities. So we're going to be working from a project that doesn't match up with the training kit tonight. So going to be a little bit different, but the overarching concept is going to be the same. I'm not sure why PMs turned into TLs. I guess they're just trying to yeah, I'm not sure. I think they're just trying to make some of the names more consistent between different things. All right, so this is the project that we are going to be working on throughout the course of the sprint. So we're going to build off of it for each guided project. So you can see it kind of come together. You can see how some of the new concepts we're learning can be integrated into an existing application. So this is the one we're going to be working with. If you want to clone it down, and we'll get started. So clone it down and then run npm install, depending on your internet connection. Give you a few minutes to do that. Or fork. Yeah, you can fork it if you'd like. That's fine. Fork it and then clone it down from the fork. So I'll be updating this repo with the code that we write at the end of each guided lecture so that you can get everything that we write if you fall behind. Yep, you can refork after the update, or you can, if you know how to merge in changes from the master branch or from the master repo, you can do that. Whatever works best for your workflow. All right, give me a thumbs up if your npm install is ready to go. Thumbs down if you need more time. No, it's not normal to freeze, Sam. Maybe you just need to give it a few more minutes. All right, so while I'm waiting for those installs to finish, let's talk about what we're going to be building. So if you have it ready to go, you can just run npm start. That's going to start your local server. And then you can go to localhost port 3000. So I've built a very simple banking app. This is what we're going to be working from throughout the course of this sprint. Essentially, this is just a simple app that has a checking account balance, it has a savings account balance, it has a total balance, total available balance, and then you can make a deposit by just typing in a number and choosing the account, right? So a very simple app. If you look at the code for the app that you just cloned down, you'll see that it's using React State. Okay, so it's using the React State methodologies that we've seen up to this point. So if you look at your app.js, you'll see we have this make deposit function that updates the account information. That make deposit is we're sending that function down as a prop to the components that rely on it. We're sending down the state for the checking account balance and the savings account balance down as props. We're essentially sending everything down through props. Okay. So we're going to be updating this to use Redux instead of React state. So just to give you a quick feel for the structure, so we have the app.js, that's like our main entry file. That's where all of our state is. And then we have a balances component that has our available balance, our checking balance, our savings balance, basically everything above the line here. That's our balances component, okay? And then everything below the line is our deposit component. That's gonna have the form. I already have everything set up for handling the input change, stuff that we've already done so that we don't have to repeat. Yep, just one npm start. We're not dealing with any server data at the moment. So just one npm start. That will probably change later down the line, but for tonight, just one. And so if you look in the deposit component, this is the component that has the form. When the form is submitted, it calls the deposit money method, which then calls the props.makeDeposit method, which is on the parent component, passes through the new amount to the parent component, which is app.js. Same thing we did in our HTTP Ajax project, right? Remember in the trinkets project, we're calling that function from the parent. And the parent is responsible for setting the state, for setting that new state, which then sets the state and then passes it back down to the children. All right, so very simple. We essentially want to take all of this React state stuff that we're doing, everything we're doing with the state here, everything we're doing with the set state and with this function, we want to extract all of this and put it into Redux instead. All right, so who can tell me what the first step is? What's the first thing we want to do? The npm installed? Nope, we're not going to be using state or set state. Well, we could import it, but what do we have to do before we import it? Good, Junior, Michelle. Yep, we need to install it. So let's npm install Redux. Okay, and then if you remember, Redux is not React specific. Okay, you can use Redux in any JavaScript framework. It's not React specific. So there's another library that we can use that helps us interface with Redux through React. You got it, Tara, React-Redux, okay? That's a separate package that's gonna help us use Redux and help us call some of those methods that we saw in the concept stuff earlier. So install Redux and React Redux. All right, now let's open up index.js. And the first step to installing Redux or to creating a Redux store, we essentially need to create that store, right? That's going to be the centralized place for all of our data in our app, our centralized Redux store. It's going to be global to the entire app. We're just going to put it in a variable at the very top of our app in index, okay? So you can do const state, or let's call it store. So it's the store. Store and state are sometimes used interchangeably. They kind of mean different things, but don't worry about the differences. Essentially, just the store is what contains the state. The state is the actual data. Yeah, you probably have faster internet, Tyler. My internet's been going very slow today. Not sure why. Junior, to install more than one library, just use a space. Yeah, you can do it separately, or you can use a space if you want. There's actually another trick. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but if you are install like something that ends with the same string, so say like you were installing package 1 and package 2. You can actually do it in brackets. Glob notation, if you've ever heard of that. You can say install 1, 2, like that. It can sometimes be a handy little trick. So the R command, our install command is an npm install redux react redux. Nope, we haven't imported it yet. Okay, so let's import it. Right below React DOM, let's say import. We're going to import something called create store. And that's going to come from React Redux. Nope, just kidding. That's going to come from Redux. Because remember, our store is not React specific. Our store, our reducers, our actions, those are not React specific. Okay, so import create store from Redux. Then we're going to say const store equals create store. We're just going to create a store. That is going to create our global store. This is the state that's going to get passed down to every component. All right, and that store, that create store function, it actually expects a reducer. This is where we're going to create our reducer. If you remember, the reducer is just a pure function. Okay, who can explain to me what a pure function is? Anybody know? What is a pure function? No side effects. Yep, exactly. It means if we send through the same data to the function, we send through the same parameters, it should always output the same thing. There are no side effects. You can call it as many times as you want. It'll always output the same thing if you input the same thing. That's what a pure function is. Okay, reducers are pure functions because everything that gets passed to it is going to receive a state and an action. Everything that gets passed to it is that's all it depends on, right? It's not depending on anything outside of the function. Yeah, you can absolutely do arrow functions. Yeah, for sure. You can do const render or reducer equals arrow function. Okay. For now, if you remember the reducer, what does the reducer need to return? Yeah, it needs to return an object. It needs to return some new state, right? It needs to take that existing state, it needs to change it up somehow and return some new state. That is the whole purpose of the reducer. Okay, so let's just return the state for now. We're not switching over any actions yet. We're just returning the state. We just want to see if it's working. Okay, and that state is going to be empty, right? Because we're not starting out with anything yet. So we need to create some initial state. So the way we do that, we're just going to say const initial state. It's going to be an object, right? Our state is just an object. We've referred to it several times as a tree, a state tree. That just means it's an object. Okay, so let's think of the state that we're storing in this application, right? So we have essentially two values. We have our checking account balance and our savings account balance. And then our available balance, which is calculated from adding together the other two balances, right? So we just need two values. We need checking. We'll start it off at 0. And savings, start it off at 0. Because we don't have a job yet, so we're broke. All right. And then we're going to assign that initial state as a default value to that state parameter. If you've never done this before, it's really easy. All you do is in the parameter, in the parentheses where the parameters are defined, you can just say equals initial state. So in this case, if reducer is called and that value is null, if there's no state value, it's going to use initial state instead. Oh, Kelsey Wells left Webpt6 print 8. That's funny. I hope I didn't scare her away. All right, so now that we have that initial state set up, and we have the reducer returning state, let's pass the reducer to the store. Okay, so we now have Redux set up. We now have an initial state that was created. We have a reducer that's taking that state in. We don't have any actions yet because we don't have anything that's happening, right? We just have some state. We only need actions if we want to change the state. But we're not changing state yet. We're just setting those initial values. We're creating that global store. It gives us a variable called store. Now we need to do something with that variable. So this is where we're going to import from that React Redux library. This is what's going to help us interface with Redux through React. Okay, there's a variable called provider. So we can say import provider from React Redux. Okay, and that provider is going to be a higher order component. Right? Remember what higher order components are? We need to wrap app in provider. Yep, we need to wrap it around. Since we're now working with React, right? React Redux, that's the library we're working with. It's going to give us this component. We now have a component that we can use to connect our Redux store to our application. So we're going to wrap app with provider like that. All right, and then provider is going to expect that store. So we're just going to say store equals store. Because it needs to initialize something, right? When we're initializing Redux in our React app, it needs to get that Redux state. It needs to get access to that. So we use that higher order component to pass in that state. If we were doing React router, good question. You can just wrap it again. You can just say router like that. You can nest higher order components as deep as you want. There's no limit to how deep you can nest. Right, and then if we were doing it in this case, then React router would have access to Redux as well, because that's inside of that component. So that has now connected our application to Redux. We are set up and ready to go. So let's actually take this stuff right here and put it in a separate file. So let's create a new file, call it reducer.js. Since we're going to have a little bit more in it later, let's just cut the initial state and the reducer function out of the index, put it in reducer. And then we're going to export a default function, which is our reducer. That way, when we start to expand our reducer, it doesn't get our index file all messy. Nope, not in component, because this isn't a component, right? This is just dealing with state. Yep, just initial state and reducer. Like that. All right, and then we just need to import reducer. Reducer. All right, so now let's connect that Redux store to our balances component. Nope, you don't need to import React in Reducer, TJ, because we're not using any React components in here, right? We're not using any JSX. This is just Redux stuff that we're doing in Reducer. This isn't React specific. Just a normal function, right? It's just a pure function. It has no side effects, no React, nothing. It's just taking in some state and it's returning some new state. Nope, Reducer doesn't have anything imported. Can you guys hear my chair squeaking? It squeaks so much, I still need to oil it up. Cool, all right. So go ahead and save those changes. So we are importing from Redux, Aaron, in here, right, when we create our store. But you remember the reducer is just a pure function. The reducer doesn't even really know about Redux, right? The reducer is just kind of like a pattern. It's a concept, right? It's not necessarily related to Redux itself. It's just a pure function that takes in some state and it's going to return some new state. Nope, you don't need to call create store in the reducer. You only need to call create store in the index because that's when we're creating our global store. Yep, the reducer is just a function that Redux is going to reference later on down the line, sometime in the future. Yep, exactly. All right, so now let's go into our balances component. And in order to connect our Redux store, in order to connect to that global store that was created, we're going to import something else from React Redux, which is a function called connect, right? Connect from React Redux. And connect is another higher order function, a higher order component, I should say, similar to provider. But in this case, we're going to call it as a function down here when we're exporting. Then we're going to pass the component as a second, calling it a second time and passing the component. If you've never done that before, it's called function currying. Essentially, you're just calling a function that returns a function, and then you're calling that new return function with something else. Okay, so now that balances component is connected to our Redux store. That's all it takes. And this connect function right here, this first time we call it, is going to take a couple parameters. Hopefully that's a good thing, Danielle. Hopefully your brain is on fire because you're just eating this all up and you are loving it. But if you're confused, please let me know. Let's keep implementing this so that you can see how it actually works. So our connect function, the first time we call it, is going to expect some parameters. The first parameter is going to be something called map state to props. Okay. This is just going to be a function, so we can define it up above the export. Okay, you'll get that in just a second, Benedict. Let me finish this up, and then we can try and explain that more in detail. So the first parameter to connect is something called map state to props. Okay, that's going to be a function that gives us our state. We just need to take that state and pluck out the items that we need for this specific component. Okay, we're essentially taking that global state, which has everything in it, and we're saying, oh, I only need this value and this value. I don't care about the rest. I only need these two things. Just take those two things from the state and assign them to the component's props so that we can access them through this.props. Okay, so that map states to props function should return a new object. And this is going to get assigned to our props, whatever we put in this object. So if you look at our component, you see we're depending on checking and savings, right, and total, because those come from the parent component, currently coming from React state, right? But we want to get it from Redux instead. So we're going to return total, checking, and savings. And each of these values is just going to come from the state. We can say state. Well, let's not do total. For checking, let's do state.checking. Savings, state.savings. Right? And then total, we can say state.checking plus state.savings. So if you look at our state, you see we have initial state, we have a checking value, which is 0. We have a savings value, which is 0. When we use this map state to props function, it's going to pass through our global state as a parameter. This is our global state right here. And we're deciding which values of that state we want, okay, by returning that object. So now we can access this stuff on our props. So we can say props.total, props.checking, props.savings. And it's going to pull that from our Redux store. So we were already doing that before because we had it connected to our React state. But now if we go into our app.js and we rip this state out, okay, so let's go into app.js. Let's take out the entire constructor, or let's just take out the state for now. Okay, take out the state. You can take out the area where we're passing through total, passing through checking, passing through savings. Take that all out. We're essentially replacing all of this with Redux. Okay, don't worry about the deposit component yet. We'll get to that in a second. But you see now this balances component, we're not passing any props to that at all. Okay, we're just calling it in the parent component. We're not passing any props. If you go into the component, you'll see we're connecting to the Redux store. Okay, so before it exports the balances, before it exports that component, it connects it to the Redux store. And then we're telling it what values to pull out of the Redux store. We're telling it we want checking, savings, and we want the total, which is adding to the checking and savings, right? So now these values that are coming from the props, right, total, checking, and savings, these are going to be the values that come from the state. Okay, so you're getting some kind of error. So maybe we can put this on one line to make it a little clearer as to what it's doing. So you're calling connect. You're passing through your map state to props function. And then the result of that connect function, the first time you call it, it's going to return a function. It's going to return another function. And you're going to call that second function with the component. And that's what gets exported from the file. Yep, exactly, Wayne. So using React Redux and Redux libraries, Connect knows how to get everything from the store, right? And it knows how to hook everything together. Oh yeah, so you can delete that, the line that's getting checking and savings from state. You can get rid of that. That was probably what was causing the error. You can get rid of total. And since we are setting total to deposit, you can get rid of that call too. We'll take care of the make deposit in a second. And that's it. We are now converted from React state to Redux in terms of displaying our information. Yeah, let's do that for sure. Okay. Let's go into Reducer. Let's say we got our first job and we now have a hefty savings account. Let's say we have 50,000 in our savings account and our checking has 20,000. All right. So now let's go to our app. Make sure you save everything. Let's go to our app, refresh. You see we now have these values that are pulling from our Redux store. This is pulling from the global state. It's not dependent on any React state. All right, I'll give you a couple minutes to catch up there. Sure. Index is very simple. All we're doing is creating the store. We're passing through our reducer. We're wrapping app in provider and giving it the store. All right, so you see this is one-way flow so far, right? Because the data is coming from above. We're creating our data in the store. The store holds our checking account balance, our savings account balance, and it's passing that through to all of its children, right? It's a one-way flow, just like with React State. All right, good so far. Any questions? So just npm start to run the React app. That will run the local server so you can go to port 3000 to see your app. Yeah, so I don't know if the order is confusing here. If we wanted to just not even put that there, we can just put that in here, right? And it would work just the same. Yeah, we can get rid of that constructor. So we're essentially tearing out everything that was dealing with the React state itself, and we're replacing it with Redux, right? So we got rid of all the state. We can get rid of this function in a minute. In fact, we can just get rid of it now, or just comment it out. So essentially, we're not sending anything through to our components. Everything is coming through Redux. Melvin getting it available balance NAN. Make sure you don't have any typos. Make sure you are calling from state.checking and state.savings, making them together. Make sure you're using numbers here instead of strings. So if you have these, don't wrap these numbers in quotes, right? Because then that makes them strings. Make sure they're numbers. Sure. One day we're going to have a live coding environment where we can all share the same code editor. That will be glorious. Okay, so it looks like balances is sending out data instead of taking it in. I guess, yeah, that could be a little bit confusing. So this isn't sending data out, right? This happens before the component renders, or as the component is rendering. It pulls in this data from the state, and it's essentially sending this through to the component, right? None of this data is getting passed back up. This is a one-way flow. If it would make more sense, we could put this above the component, right? Something like that. And even if we wanted to, we wouldn't even have to do that. We could even just return the state, return the entire state, and then we would have access to every state value in our component, right? Instead of picking and choosing which pieces of state we want. But if our state was really large, we wouldn't want to do that. We want to specifically say which pieces of the state we want. All right, so hopefully everybody is caught up. Hopefully we got it all working. Any questions aside from like syntax errors? Any questions about the flow? What certain pieces of code are doing? Yeah, this is a very simple example, but let's keep going so that we can see how it gets even more powerful as we use state in different places and as we update it. All right. So if you'll notice in our deposit component, we have another current total down here, right? We were using that current total again. And since we're pulling from a global Redux store, we can use that again in that deposit component. So let me close a couple of these files. I have more room. Let's go into the deposit component. And what do we need to do to connect this deposit component to the Redux store? What do we need to do? So we want to access that checking account and the savings account amounts in the state, right? How do we connect this component to that state? Nice. Yep, we need to import connect from React Redux. Okay. And then Sam got it. We need to connect our component using that function down when it's exported. Remember, that's as a higher order function. This is a higher order function. So it's a function that returns a function. So we're going to call connect. Connect is going to call deposit. We're going to pass through map state to props, right? We're going to create that function. We're going to say const map state to props equals state, arrow function. So we just need the total, right? We don't care about the individual checking account balance and the individual saving account balance. We just want the total. So how do we extract that value from the global state and return it from this function? What do we need to do? We need to return an object that has the total. How do we get that total? Nice. Yep. We need to do state.checking plus state.savings. Yeah, Junior, that's a good question, actually. So connect itself is not a component, right? Connect is simply a function that expects a component. It's a higher order function that expects a component. It's not a component itself. And usually only components themselves are uppercase like that. Cool. And that's it. So now deposit is connected to our Redux store as well. You see, we now have the current total and deposit. You see, we're using that value twice in different components without having to pass them through those props, without having to do prop drilling. And the cool thing is, if that value changes at any time in our global state, the new value will get sent down to any component that's subscribed to that value. So if our savings account value changes, that will recalculate our available balance in this component and in this component. All right. We good so far? Has everybody caught up on the deposit component? So now we need to create some actions, right? We need this form to essentially connect to our Redux store and be able to change the value. If we make a deposit, we need to add to savings, we need to add to checking, and anything else that might come later on down the road. So if you remember the Redux flow, we do that through actions, right? Actions are what get consumed by the reducer, and the reducer is what changes the state. So let's create some actions. Create a new file in source, not in components, in source. Let's create a new file called actions.ps. Okay, so we need an action type. That's the first thing. So if you look at our form, what is the action type going to be? Any ideas? What should the action type be? So remember, we're gonna make it a constant, right? So it's going to be one of those uppercase, all caps, constant values that's going to be describing what's happening. So what should we call it? Kayla says deposit, 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 submit deposit. Yeah. Since our title says make deposit, let's call it make deposit. All right, so let's say const make deposit equals make deposit. And why do we do that again? Why are we setting a string to a value that is the same? To avoid typos, yep. Because we're going to be using this make deposit variable. We're going to be using that all over the place. And if we're just using a string, there's a high chance that we misspell it somewhere. All right, so that is our action type. All right, so now let's create our action creator. Yep, it's like a symbol. Because if we misspell something here, if we try and use this constant somewhere and we misspell, let's say we leave out the I, our JavaScript is going to yell at us and say that that variable doesn't exist, right? Versus if this was a string, make deposit, and we accidentally left out the I, it's not going to catch that right away. That's going to be an unknown error that will be really difficult to debug later down the line. Yeah, you can actually call this anything you want. Like you could put anything you want in this string. Like you could say make deposit. Deposit. You can call it whatever you want, but essentially it's good common practice to just make it the same name as the variable name. Yep, exactly, Kevin. Yep, and now anytime we need to call that action, we just use that constant, right? So let's also export it. So let's export the const make deposit so that we can import it in all the places that we need to use it. So now let's create our action creator. And remember, action creators are just functions that return actions. All right. So we can export, we want to export our action creator function. It can be called anything. You can name your action creator anything you want. Let's call it make deposit, lowercase. It's going to be a function. Yeah, export is just a global JavaScript keyword that allows us to import this somewhere else in a different file. All right, and our make deposit function, when we call it, we're gonna have to pass it like an amount, right? We have to pass it an amount that we're depositing, and we have to pass it the account type, right? Whether it's checking or savings. So we're gonna pass those two values through as parameters. And then we're gonna return an action. Okay, if you remember our actions, it's just gonna be an object. Actions are just objects. It's going to have a type. What's the action type? Make deposit, right? So we're going to copy that constant. We're going to use it there. And what's the other thing an action needs? So an action has a type and a payload. Nice. What's our payload going to be? When this make deposit function gets called, what's our payload going to be for our action? We're making a deposit. Yep, we need the amount and the account. So we can send through another object and pass through amount, account. Our payload can be an object, it can be a string, it can be anything you want. Since we have multiple values that we're dealing with here, we can make it an object, just for simplicity. All right, so now we have our action and our action creator. So now we just need to use that action inside of our deposit component. So I'll give you a couple seconds to catch up there. We good? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Awesome. So now let's go into our deposit component and let's use that action, right? We can now call that action in the context of Redux React, of React Redux, and it will get passed through to the reducer, okay? So let's import that action. Let's say import brackets. We're gonna import make deposit from // since it's in the directory above, actions. So that's gonna get that action from here. We now have that function. Okay, and you see from before, we were already calling this .props.make deposit, and that was coming through React state, right? So if you looked at the app.js file from before, we had this make deposit function, and that was setting the state, and we had to pass that function down through a prop in the deposit, but we no longer need that. Oops, that was a little too much. Get rid of that. And instead of calling it through a prop, or instead of passing it through a prop, we can come down to that connect function and we can attach it to the props of this component. So there's a second parameter we can pass through to connect. So right now we're passing map state to props. There's a second one we can call, which is called map dispatch to props. Okay. Now what dispatch is, I don't think we talked about dispatch yet, but dispatch it's kind of between the action and the reducer. So the way that Redux works is when you call an action creator, it dispatches that to the reducer. It sends that action creator, that action object to the reducer. That's referred to as dispatching, all right? And then once that reducer receives that action, it can then change the state. Okay, so we need to dispatch that action to the reducer. And React Redux gives us this map dispatch to props. So that's just going to be another function. And this time it's going to take a dispatch parameter. And then just like we did with map state to props, we're going to return an object. And then we're going to call the function whatever we want. We can call it deposit, right? And then this is going to return a function because we don't want it to call right away. We want to be able to call it when we want. This is a higher order function. And then we're going to call dispatch. That's going to dispatch our action. And dispatch is going to expect some kind of action. Okay. In order to get our action, we just have to call our action creator function. So we would call make deposit. And if you remember make deposit, our action, that when you call that function, that's returning our action, right? That's what the dispatcher expects. It expects that action object. Okay. And then you'll remember that make deposit expects an amount and a count. So we can pass that through here. When we call it, we're going to receive a count and amount. And we're going to send that through to make deposit like that. All right. If that's a lot to type, there's actually a shorthand in Redux, in React Redux that we can do that does the same thing. Yep, Mo, you're ahead of me. So now we can, instead of doing all of this, we can just say that. That's the same thing. Right? So now we have access to deposit as a function on our component through our props. We didn't delete this.props.makeDeposit. We're still calling it, except now we're going to call, instead of .makeDeposit, what are we going to call? We're going to call deposit. So we named it deposit down here, right? We can name this anything. We could say, give me money, right? And then when you call it, you're going to call this.props.giveMeMoney. All right, Benedict, which part are you confused on? Whoops, don't want to do that. So React Redux is essentially giving us this function. It's giving us this function that's going to dispatch an action to the reducer and update the state for us. All we have to do is call the function. Not yet, Anthony. We're gonna have to do that when we implement this in our reducer. Okay, so if you remember, the only way for our React component to update the state is to go through actions. It has to call an action. And the action gets passed through as it gets dispatched to the reducer. And the reducer looks at that action, it looks at the new state, and it returns a new state, and the new state gets passed through, right? It's just this continuous flow, this one-way flow. Oh, sorry, Sam. Yeah, I changed that. So whatever you name the key in your object here, that's the function that you call up here, right? So we can call it whatever we want. We can call it deposit. We can call it make me money, make deposit, right? We can call it make deposit. And then that's what you call on your props, right? So this connect function is attaching stuff to our props that we can use. That is the action, right? So when we call that, that action is getting dispatched to the reducer. Yeah, I understand that, Benedict. I'll update all of this code in the GitHub repo afterwards so you can look at it more carefully. Sure. So the only thing we changed up here is we just imported make deposit from the actions file. You probably could, Tyler. I don't know if you can use emojis in JavaScript source code. You might be able to. I don't know. Looks like we're pretty much out of time, but we do need to do one more thing. So stick with me here. We'll go a little bit over. I'll give you a couple of seconds to catch up there, and then we'll move on to the last part of this. The constructor didn't change at all, Ian. We just have the same stuff in the constructor that was in there before. All right, so if we save that, let's go into our action. You don't have to follow along with this part, but just for demonstration purposes, let's try logging something out. Let's log out the amount and the account when we call make deposit, right? Just so that we can see what's happening. So now if we go back into our app, open up your console, enter an amount, hit deposit. You see now it logs out our values. We're calling that function. We're calling that action creator function. There is no third thing in state. State just has the amount and the account, stuff that was already there previously just from the form. All right. So when we match dispatch to props, that's assigning action creator functions to our props that we can then call later. All right. I know this is confusing. I promise it will click. Just keep at it. All right. So now that we're calling that action creator and it's dispatching, what's the last step that we need to do in order to update our state? Who can tell me what's the last step we need? Yep, Matt got it. We need to update our reducer. So our action is now getting dispatched to the reducer, right? The reducer is receiving that action. We need to update our reducer to check for that action and update the state based on it. Okay, so right now we're just returning the state. That's what it does by default. But we're actually receiving this action right here. And this action is going to be this object right here. It's going to have a type and it's going to have a payload. So all we need to do is switch over the action type. We're essentially saying if the action type equals case make deposit equals that action type, then do something, right? If it doesn't match any action type, default, it's the keyword that you use in a switch statement, then just return the default state. Return the current state, because there's no change. Okay, any questions about switch statements or what's happening there? So our action comes in when that action creator dispatches the action. That action comes into this reducer. We're just checking the type and we're going to do something specific based on that type. We're going to change the state. We're going to return new state. All right, so in here, we need to return some new state, right? So we're just going to return an object. And remember, it's immutable, right? We can't just change state. We have to return new state. We have to spread state, right? And then we need to assign the value that comes through the payload to the state, right? So if we're updating checking, we need to assign the amount to the checking amount. If we're updating savings, we need to assign the amount to the savings amount, okay? If you remember how we do that, we can use brackets in our key name, and we can say action.payload.account, right? So that's either going to be checking or savings, the two values in our state. And we're going to set it to action.payload.amount. Okay, that's essentially saying take our current state and update whatever value is coming through this action, update that amount in the state, and return that new state object. Right? It completes that cycle. So now a new state object is returned, and that new state object is going to get sent down to all of the components that are depending on that value. Map dispatch to props is something that comes with Redux Benedict. You can call that anything you want, but that's what it does. You just have to pass it through as a second parameter to connect. Okay, and then we don't need to add it, Aaron, because you remember we're doing that in the component itself, right? We're just taking those two values and adding them together when we need the total. So we only need to update the checking value and the savings value. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right. We're going to do that. We need to add to the current value, right? We don't want to reassign the value. That was a good catch, actually. Good catch, Aaron. So instead of returning just the new value, so we don't, if we put a value in here, we don't want that to be the new value of our bank account. We want to add to the current value, right? So how do we do that? Any ideas, Aaron? We're going to say const new amount, right? Let's call it new amount, just in a variable. Yeah, so what do we need in this variable? So we have an action.payload.amount, right? That's coming from the form. We also need to be sure to parse it as an integer. So you can just say parse int, because it's going to be a string coming in from the form, but we need it to be a number. What do we add that to? Plus something. We're going to just add it to the payload amount, with this current state amount, right? So we can say state dot or state whatever account we're looking at, and we can say action.payload.account. And then instead of just passing through a new value, we can pass through the new amount. So that is a reducer. Really, it's just a switch statement that's looking at the action type, and it's returning a new state based on the payload data. That's all it is when it comes down to it. We can even shorten this a little bit since we're calling action.payload a whole bunch of times. We can destructure it to amount and account from action payload, right? And then we don't have to call action.payload over and over again. All right, I know we're a little bit over on time. Bear with me. Let's see if this works. Oh, yep. Thank you. All right. Do we need anything else? Should we see if it works? Make sure you're also importing your action type. So VS Code did it for me automatically, which I don't love, but make sure you import that type. Remember, because we're using it, we're checking for that make deposit. So we got to import that from our actions file, that action type. We could just make this a string, remember, but we don't want to, we want to reduce our risk of typos. So in order to do that, we just use a constant instead. So a reducer is looking at that action and it's taking some kind of, making some kind of state change based on that action. All right, let's see if it works. Save that. Come into your page. Let's make a deposit for $100,000 to our checking account. Hit deposit, and look at that. You see it changed to the state everywhere those values were being used, right? It changed the checking account value, but then it also changed all of the available balance values because that global state value changed and it passed down to everything else that was depending on that value. All right, and that is Redux. We just implemented the entire Redux flow. Okay, we implemented some action types, action creators, and some actions. We implemented a reducer to take those actions in and change the state. We created some default state, and we hooked our components up to the state, right? That is the full Redux flow. Questions, concerns? Yep, for sure. Let me know how you're feeling. Responses are completely anonymous. How are we feeling about Redux? Feeling good about it, understanding everything, understanding the flow. Okay, got some ones, some twos, a lot of threes and fours. I promise it will click for you eventually. If it's confusing, you just can't grasp it right now. I promise as soon as you get into it and start actually coding stuff with it, it'll click. Some of you, it'll take a little bit longer, and that's totally fine. Just take your time, take it slow, and just work through it, start implementing stuff until it clicks for you. Once you start doing more on top of like a single action, right now we just have a single action that updates our deposit. But once you start implementing more stuff that has different action types and different stuff that's happening, different pieces of state, you'll see how it all starts to kind of come together and work together. So it won't actually be different once you start on the assignment. Like it'll be a different assignment. Obviously, there's going to be a different requirement, but still the overarching concept is the same, right? You're still using Redux. You're still using React Redux. You're still using all the same methods. It's still the same concept and the same syntax. You're just going to have to, think about it and understand it a little more so that you can morph it into different contexts, into different projects. I mean, if it's working for you and you're understanding the flow, it's really not any more complicated than that. And you just have to wrap your head around that flow. And there are a lot of pieces to it for sure. There's action creators, action types, but it makes it a little bit easier, the fact that it just flows in one direction, right? You don't have actions talking to the store. You don't have the UI talking to reducers. All you have to think about is just the one-way flow, right? UI is only going to talk to actions. Actions are only going to talk to the reducer. Reducer is only going to talk to the state. So that's really all there is to it, just those 4 steps. All right. Yep, and it will seem different when you start a new project, and that's good for you, right? It's good for you to learn how to implement the concept in other capacities. So stick with it. Good luck with the project. I think it's going to be working on the Redux counter project. So it should be similar to what we did tonight because you're just going to be incrementing a number. So yeah, hopefully this will click for you at some point. If it hasn't clicked for you yet, be patient. I promise it will click for you eventually. Good luck with the project. Let us know if you have any questions, and thanks for sticking with it tonight. Have a good night, everyone.